Hey, welcome back. Today, I want to tell you about a trip up Everest where a couple laughed off a warning from their Sherpa, a guy with almost 20 years on that mountain, who'd stood on top more times than most people do anything in their whole life. The weather looked perfect. He told them it wouldn't stay that way. They laughed it off anyway. What happened next is one of the wildest and honestly saddest stories I've dug into, because so much of it could have gone differently. Let's get into it. It's May 18th, 2023. I'm looking at the south col of Mount Everest, sitting nearly 26,000 feet up. By 9 at night, the temperature is hovering around -20 degrees. Over a dozen teams are gearing up to push for the summit, with headlamps visible between tents. Guides prepared oxygen cylinders, regulators, and crampons before departure. Among them were Daniel and Lilibeth Ramsey, a married couple from California. Daniel was 61, Lilibeth was 48. Daniel had just retired after 30 years working in aerospace logistics. He'd spent his career around engineers, but weather and mountain safety weren't really his thing. He leaned on the guides for all of that. Over the past 6 years, he'd climbed a handful of big mountains around the world, chasing this exact goal, one peak at a time. A solid, experienced climber, just not a mountain expert himself. Lilibeth, his wife, was a corporate lawyer and had done that same run of climbs alongside him. Friends said she was physically strong, but like a lot of people on that mountain, not really the one calling the shots on the technical stuff. Their goal was simple. After 2 years of training, planning, and doctor visits, they just wanted to reach the top together. Looking at everything they did to prepare, the training logs, the medical checkups, the slow climb up through the camps to get their bodies used to the altitude. This wasn't a couple who wandered up there on a whim. They'd put in real work, spent real money, and given up real time to get to this exact spot on this exact night, the way plenty of people do every single season. So far, they'd done everything right. Their lead guide, a Sherpa named Nuru Chiring, had 19 seasons on Everest and had reached the summit more times than most people climb anything at all. And let me emphasize this one. Nuru had 19 years of experience climbing Mount Everest. His job went way beyond just showing them where to walk. He managed their pace, their air supply, their gear, when they needed to turn around, and stayed in constant radio contact with the base camp the whole way up. He'd talked hundreds of clients through this exact stretch of mountain, and he'd learned, the hard way probably, that no two summit nights ever play out quite the same, even when the forecast, the route, and the team all look almost identical on paper. The forecast to him was a tool, not the truth. Daniel wasn't careless about planning, quite the opposite. Before leaving for Nepal, he'd paid for a premium mountain forecasting service that combined several weather models into one report. Throughout the expedition, he checked those forecasts whenever new updates became available. They'd been remarkably accurate all the way through the lower camps, which only reinforced his confidence that good planning and good data could eliminate most of the uncertainty. Nuru looked at the same forecasts too. The difference was that he never treated them as the final answer. For those of you new to this channel and not familiar with Mount Everest, here's what you need to know before we go further. Climbers don't just walk up the mountain. They leave camp in total darkness, hours before sunrise, and follow ropes bolted into the mountain, passing through a few key points along the way. First a spot called the balcony, then the south summit, then finally the top itself. There's no shortcuts up there. You either keep pace or you fall behind it. And falling behind is a bigger deal than it sounds. At that altitude, standing still doesn't mean resting. Every minute you're stopped, you're still burning oxygen from a limited supply and losing body heat you can't get back. You're not gaining anything by stopping. You're just spending resources you don't get to refill until you're back down. Every so often, everyone has to stop and reclip their gear onto the next stretch of rope, one climber at a time. So if the person ahead of you is slow, the whole line behind them is slow too, no matter how strong or fast any individual climber happens to be. Even with bottled oxygen, your body is still getting beaten up at that height, and every tank only holds so much. Reaching the top is optional up there. Getting back down is not. That's the whole reason people call it the death zone. Experienced Everest guides don't rely on just one source of information. They constantly compare weather forecasts, radio reports from teams higher on the mountain, how fast their own climbers are moving, oxygen use, cloud patterns, and what they can actually see around them. One of those visual clues is something called a summit plume, a stream of snow blowing off the very top of the mountain. By itself, a plume doesn't automatically mean danger. Guides pay attention to whether it's growing, how quickly it's changing, and whether it matches the other warning signs they're already seeing. Keep that in mind because it becomes an important part of what Nuru notices that night. Teams had been holding off on the summit push all week because the wind-up high wouldn't settle down. But by the 18th, the forecast finally opened a short, calm window that night into the next day. And because everyone had been waiting on it, this turned into one of the busiest summit nights of the whole season. Over 100 climbers from different teams, all planning to leave within a few hours of each other, all trusting the same short window of good weather to get them up and back down safely. Guides knew the rope lines would be jammed. They figured it would still be manageable, as long as everybody kept moving at roughly the pace the plan called for. Around 9:15 that night, while everyone else finished packing, Nuru stepped outside and looked up at the summit. He stood there long enough that a couple of climbers from a nearby tent noticed and glanced up too, not sure what they were looking for. One of them, interviewed afterward, said Nuru didn't move for almost a full minute, just stood with his head tilted back, watching the top of the mountain in silence. What he noticed was a thin stream of snow blowing off the summit toward the northeast, a summit plume, and it looked slightly larger than it had been an hour earlier. By itself, that wasn't enough to change plans, but it didn't match the calm conditions the forecast was still predicting, so Nuru made a mental note to keep watching it alongside everything else during the climb. According to Nuru's account, he walked back to the tents and told Daniel and Lilibeth what he'd seen. The wind at the summit was already moving faster than the forecast had predicted. He said he wanted them prepared to turn back early if conditions kept worsening, regardless of how close they were to the top. He wasn't telling them to cancel the climb. He was telling them to be willing to stop. And this is the part that really sticks with me. Daniel laughed it off. They'd paid for this trip, trained for 2 years, and every other team on the mountain was still gearing up too. Lilibeth pointed to the latest forecast update on Daniel's satellite device. Every model still showed the summit window, holding through the next day. Daniel had been checking those updates for days, and so far they'd been right every time. Based on the weather forecasts they'd been relying on throughout the expedition, they chose to continue with the original plan. But I find their reaction, understandable reaction, really. Their response also fit what later expedition records showed. Throughout the climb, Daniel consistently relied on the commercial forecast updates alongside Nuru's guidance. At that point, Nuru did not recommend canceling the climb, but witnesses later recalled that he continued checking the summit plume throughout the night. 100 other climbers were making the exact same call he was, all across the South Col at that exact moment. So the plan stood, and they continue. At 20-10, Daniel, Lilibeth, and Nuru clipped onto the rope and started climbing toward the balcony. One of 100 headlamps stretched up the mountainside. Everything looked normal, ropes secure, oxygen flowing, forecast holding. The growing summit plume remained the only unusual weather sign noted by Nuru before departure. The first stretch out of camp isn't technical, but it locks everyone into the exact same pace immediately. One rope, one anchor at a time. No passing, no shortcuts. No way for a stronger climber to simply walk around a slower one. By the time the Ramseys reached the lower anchors, small delays had already stacked up across the route. Someone adjusting gear, someone catching their breath, someone moving slower than they had at base camp weeks earlier when the air was thicker. None of it was serious on its own. It was like highway traffic. No crashes, no hard brakes, just enough small slowdowns to bring the whole line to a crawl. The oxygen continued flowing during each delay, reducing the reserve available for the descent. Around 11:30, a guide descending from higher up radioed base camp about stronger wind above the balcony. It's not urgent yet, but the first real sign the mountain was changing earlier than planned. Nuru glanced back toward the summit again. The plume was noticeably longer now than when they'd left camp. Not a huge change, but enough of one that he noticed it immediately. During a brief stop at one of the anchors, Daniel checked the latest weather update on his satellite communicator. It still showed the summit window holding. Nuru checked the ridgeline, watched the plume, listened to radio traffic from guides farther up the route, and compared all of it with what he was seeing around him. As the Ramseys pushed toward the balcony, snow wasn't drifting straight down anymore. It was streaming sideways across the ridge in visible sheets. Headlamps higher up would vanish behind blowing snow and pop back into view a few seconds later. Still climbable, just not as calm as it had felt back at camp a few hours earlier. Nuru didn't say anything this time, but climbers nearby noticed him looking back toward the summit several more times than usual, almost like he was keeping eye on the plume. Just after midnight, the route jammed up several teams at once, right where the terrain narrowed into a single file line along the ridge. Guides spread climbers out to ease the crowding. The safer move, but it slowed everybody down even further. That's one of the hard truths about Everest. The safer choice can still cost you time, and up there, base camp kept logging routine check-ins roughly every half hour, and the Ramseys were right where they were supposed to be, moving along with everyone else. Investigators later concluded that those delays reduced the team's available safety margin. Around 20 to 1 in the morning, another Sherpa quietly mentioned the same plume over the radio to Nuru. Climbers from a different team had noticed it too, clearly longer than when they'd left camp, streaming harder against a sky that was otherwise still clear and full of stars. Nobody thought it was serious enough to turn back on its own. Weather forecasts continued showing an acceptable summit window, while multiple Sherpas independently reported increasing wind, blowing snow, and changing conditions near the summit. None of those signs alone demanded an immediate retreat. Together, though, they painted a picture that experienced guides were paying close attention to, even before updated forecasts reflected the change. Several experienced guides independently reported noticing the same growing summit plume before updated forecasts reflected the change. Getting close to the balcony, Daniel paused at another anchor when the line ahead slowed. Still clipped in, still breathing steady, nothing unusual. The whole route was backing up the same way. A few minutes later, his oxygen mask started delivering air unevenly. That unsettling feeling of pulling in a breath and not quite getting a full one back. Moisture had frozen inside the valve, a rare problem in that kind of cold, but not an unheard of one. Nuru didn't panic. He pulled the team aside, out of the main traffic, cleared the ice by hand, and had it working again within minutes. A clean fix. But investigators later confirmed the fix itself cost them more time on a climb that had already slowed to a crawl, and by the time they rejoined the rope, the line ahead had grown even longer. That time was gone for good, and there was no getting it back, no matter how smoothly the rest of the climb went from there. Above the balcony, everything gets more exposed. Steep slopes, almost nowhere to duck out of the wind, ropes bolted into rock and old snow from earlier in the season. Lower down, a ridge or a big rock might block a gust for a second. Around 2:15, several teams separately reported the wind had gone from gusting to blowing, steady and constant, not letting up between bursts the way it had been earlier in the night. Climbers descending later that day told rangers they'd needed both hands at almost every rope change just to keep from getting knocked sideways. Some gusts strong enough to throw their balance off for a full second before they could reset their footing. One climber, interviewed afterward, said the wind at that elevation was the worst he'd felt in 3 seasons on the mountain. Nuru checked their pace long before his normal turnaround point. Daniel noticed him glance at his watch, then up toward the ridgeline, then back at the line of climbers ahead. By then, it wasn't the clock itself that worried him. It was the team's rate of progress. After hours of waiting at rope anchors and losing time to congestion, he could already tell they were no longer climbing fast enough to reach the summit and return within the safety window his team planned before leaving Camp 4. Continuing upward no longer meant chasing the summit. It meant pushing the descent deeper into the part of the day when stronger winds had already begun arriving. Even if they somehow reached the top, they would almost certainly be descending later than planned, with less oxygen than expected. This was the point where Nuru stopped thinking about whether they could reach the summit and started thinking only about whether they could get everyone back alive. Hours earlier, the growing plume had been only one of several signs Nuru was watching. Now it matched what he was feeling on the ridge, hearing over the radio, and seeing in the team's slower pace. Taken together, those signs convinced him the mountain was changing faster than the forecasts suggested. According to Nuru's later account, Daniel initially questioned the decision. From his perspective, they had already climbed for hours. Other teams were still moving upward, and turning back without even reaching the south summit felt like giving up after coming so far. But Nuru wasn't judging the climb by distance anymore. He was judging it by the time, oxygen remaining, crowding ahead, and the weather developing above them. The changing conditions matched the warning Nuru had given several hours earlier. The forecast hadn't completely failed. They simply couldn't react as quickly as the mountain itself. Nuru made the turnaround decision before the situation became critical because he recognized that their pace and the strengthening wind had already erased the safety margin needed for the rest of the climb. Climbers who passed them on the way Down confirmed that Daniel and Lilibeth were still clipped into the fixed rope and moving under Nuru's guidance after turning around below the south summit. At the time of those sightings, neither appeared to have suffered a fall or a visible injury, and their equipment remained attached. Those climbers did not see what happened later. Their statements only established that the team had begun descending safely before worsening conditions eventually separated them from other witnesses. The descent followed the same rope, but now every handoff took longer. Cold and hours of exposure make even the simplest moves harder. Your hands stop working right, and clipping onto a rope turns into a real struggle when your fingers won't fully close around anything anymore. On top of that, they kept having to stop and let climbers heading up the pass on the narrow sections. The route doesn't clear out just because you're going the other way, and there's rarely room for two lines on a ridge that only fits one. These were small delays, not one big one, but they happened on the same stretch where they had the least time to spare. Each stop looked routine by itself. Investigators later found that, together, they added up to a real loss of time. Radio contact stayed normal and intermittent, nothing alarming, no distress calls, just the usual short check-ins you'd expect on that part of the mountain, where signal comes and goes depending on which side of a ridge you're standing on. Guides lower down kept reporting stronger wind through the early morning, blowing snow, wiping out visibility, and swallowing boot prints, until climbers were leaning almost entirely on the rope itself rather than any visible trail in the snow. At 12 minutes past 4, Lilibeth's tracker transmitted its regular scheduled location update. It was automatic and appeared no different from the earlier pings. The transmission confirmed the location of her tracker at that time, but it did not show her physical condition or whether the team was still moving. It became the final electronic record connected to Daniel and Lilibeth before contact was lost. When they failed to return within the expected window, Base Camp began comparing radio logs, tracker positions, and statements from climbers who had already descended. There had been no witnessed fall, no emergency transmissions, and no final radio call explaining what had happened. The available records only showed where the team had last been seen and where Lilibeth's tracker had last transmitted. Strong winds continued across the upper mountain, preventing a rescue team from climbing immediately. Conditions remained too dangerous for a search through the rest of the day, and it's a brutal position to be in, knowing where two people were last recorded but not knowing exactly what had happened after that, while also knowing that sending rescuers into the same conditions could create more casualties. Rescue teams waited until conditions improved because attempting a search immediately would have exposed rescuers to the same hazards. The search started early the next morning, once the wind eased enough for rescuers to move safely. Following the fixed line, the team compared Lilibeth's final tracker position with the last sightings reported by descending climbers. They found no large avalanche debris, severed rope, or damaged anchor that would point to a major mechanical accident along that section of the route. Daniel and Lilibeth were located several hundred feet below the position where they had last been seen. Both remained connected to the fixed line through their safety systems. Because nobody had witnessed their final moments, the recovery scene became the most important physical evidence available to investigators. Recovery. The team photographed what could be documented safely: the oxygen cylinders, masks, harnesses, safety clips, and the position of both climbers along the fixed line. One mask contained ice, similar to the buildup Nuru had cleared earlier that night. Post-recovery inspection found no obvious mechanical defect, proving that the regulator had failed again. However, the equipment could not reveal exactly when Daniel or Lilibeth became unable to continue descending. Pressure readings indicated most oxygen had been consumed, likely driven by congestion, delays, and extended time above Camp 4, though exact depletion moments remain unknown. Radio logs showed no distress calls or emergency signals after descent began. Investigators noted this does not imply stability, as extreme exhaustion, confusion, and cold injuries at high altitude can prevent climbers from operating communication or emergency devices. Like most recoveries on that part of the mountain, the operation happened in stages. The altitude, the terrain, and the fact that the rescuers themselves were still relying on bottled oxygen made moving quickly basically impossible, no matter how much anyone wanted to. It stretched across many hours, with guides from more than one team pitching in whenever the weather gave them a window to move, taking turns carrying weight that nobody up there could carry alone for long. It's something people rarely think about. Even once an accident is technically over, the mountain still decides what the people cleaning up afterward are and aren't allowed to do. Investigators used weather records, radio logs, tracker data, and witness statements to establish the team's progress, turnaround decision, worsening winds, and final location. However, the exact minute and order of incapacitation remained unknown due to a lack of eyewitnesses. They concluded that Daniel and Lilibeth likely succumbed during the descent due to extreme altitude, high winds, severe cold, and low oxygen. Their positions and intact gear indicated they gradually lost mobility rather than falling victim to an avalanche or rote failure. Ultimately, the findings were a reconstruction rather than an eyewitness account. Intact safety equipment, early strengthening winds, and partial tracking data confirmed their final movements, but not their exact final moments. And here's what really gets me about this whole case. There wasn't one single mistake, no dramatic equipment failure, no obvious villain, nobody doing anything reckless in the moment. Crowding slowed the climb, extra stops burned out oxygen meant for the way down, a mask iced over and cost them more time, even though it was fixed correctly by an experienced guide who did everything right in the moment it happened. Then the wind arrived earlier than forecast, leaving them with less time and oxygen for the descent. Each delay, on its own, was something an experienced team might have managed, and Nuru had made a defensible decision to turn them around before the South Summit. Because nobody saw their final deterioration, investigators could not identify one exact moment when the climb became fatal. Their conclusion was that the accumulated delays, extreme altitude, worsening cold, wind exposure, and reduced oxygen reserve gradually overwhelmed them somewhere below the final confirmed sighting. In the weeks after the incident, guides from several teams discussed the congestion that night, including departure spacing, turnaround discipline, and how much weight to give real-time wind observations when forecasts still looked acceptable. Those discussions did not amount to a formal change across Everest operators, but the Ramsey climb became another example of why guides continually compare forecasts with pace, oxygen use, crowding, radio reports, and the conditions directly in front of them. The summit plume was part of that discussion, not as a warning that automatically required teams to turn around, but as one visible sign that could become important when it appeared alongside strengthening wind, slower progress, and increasing oxygen use. Daniel and Lilibeth never reached the summit. They turned back after Nuru judged that their pace and the worsening wind had erased the safety margin needed to continue. No one saw their actual moment of death, so the final part of the story had to be reconstructed from their last sightings. The tracker transmission, weather records, oxygen readings, radio logs, and the positions in which they were found. According to Nuru's account, he walked back to the tents and told Daniel and Lilibeth what he'd seen. Combined with his experience and the way the mountain looked that evening, the growing plume suggested the wind near the summit might already be stronger than the forecast indicated. Witnesses recalled that Daniel laughed off the warning. Despite Nuru's extensive background and the specific, non-vague nature of the warning delivered to their faces, the team chose to begin the summit push. Several hours into the climb, once the team's pace had slipped behind schedule and the wind strengthened exactly as Nuru feared, he ended the summit attempt before they reached the South Summit. By then, the delays, crowding, and worsening weather had already consumed the safety margin they needed to get back to camp safely. What stays with me isn't that the forecast was wrong. It mostly wasn't. It's that Everest can change faster than any model can update. On that mountain, satellites tell you what should happen. Sherpas spend their lives learning to recognize what is already happening. Throughout the expedition, Daniel frequently checked commercial weather forecasts, while Nuru relied on both forecast information and direct observation of mountain conditions. By the time those two finally agreed with each other, there wasn't enough time left to make the difference matter. If this kind of deep dive into what actually happens up there is your kind of thing, let me know in the comments, and I'll keep digging into more of these stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.